1908 is an important year in Danish educational history because this was the year that the community schools became fully integrated. No more separation of public boys and girls school, although private schools were still allowed to separate the sexes. In this video I have only covered the schools that were operating in 1908 but has since either moved or gone out of business. This is especially important for the private schools since they are much more volatile in nature, in that they are much more reliant on the reputation of the headmaster. I should remark that the year given after the name of the school is not the age of the school but of the building, and if there is a name underneath, this is the name of the architect. It's not without challenges to use a century-old gazetteer to locate sites. Let's for instance take the St. Joseph's School. Since 1915 they have been located in this building, but back in 1908 the address was Tolbooth Road number 14. However, there is no Tolbooth Road. There is a Tolbooth Street, which in 1908 held this school. So you have to know that Tolbooth Road of 1908 is Esplanade today. And back in 1908, that street actually held two schools, the other one in number 34. This building has a fascinating story of its own because it used to be the home of Jakob Brøndum Scavenius Estrup. One day when he stepped outside his gate, he was the victim of an assassination attempt. He was shot at twice, but only one bullet hit the target, and that was deflected by a silver button. Estrup not only survived, he actually lived to become the longest serving cabinet minister in Danish history, and it is until now the only assassination attempt on a sitting minister. Now Tolbooth Road just changed the name, but what do you do when a whole street is swallowed by another? This happened to the Angular Road, which was swallowed by Olsen Avenue, and this meant that the former number 3 is now number 39. What about this challenge? Miss Heiberg's school was in 1908 situated at H.C. Ørsted Road number 22A. Seems simple enough until you realize that in the census of 1906 there were 3 buildings on the premises, number 22A, B and C, but today there are 8, going up to 22H, and 3 of them, A, B and H, weren't built in 1908. So which building, if still standing, did house Miss Heiberg's school? Now, you've been forgiven if you think that the Heiberg School of today has anything to do with the previous entry. It has not, because the Heiberg School of today was founded in 2001 at an address that in 1908 did house a school, but this was the Royal Boarding School. Back then there were actually a school on the neighboring plot also, but that has been torn down, and the road was called the New Limekiln Road. By 1908 it had already given up both of its endings, and the last bit was to be swallowed by Randersgade in the 1930s, and this road already had 2 other schools that still exists and therefore is not covered by this video. The last example of the trials and tribulations of using an old gazetteer, this is number 25 on Northbridge Street. According to the gazetteer of 1908, there should be 2 schools nearby. One in number 27, which is the building to the right. This is actually the Catholic Church of the Holy Sacrament, dedicated to St. Willard, but it doesn't actually carry his name. And there was a school in the backyard. Those buildings are now occupied by St. Ansgar School, and I'll return to them later. The other school is supposed to be in number 15. Problem is that to the left of number 25, there's roads dating back to the 18th century, and on the other side of that road is number 13. So there is no number 15. Turns out that part of the street has been renumbered, and the 1908 number 15 is today the number 7A. Let's round up the St. Ansgar School. It moved into Northbridge Street number 27 in 1923. And before that, its home had been at Broad Street. In fact, it had two different schools because there was a separate girls and a separate boys school neighboring each other. This is where it gets complicated because according to the school itself, it was founded in 1906, although this particular school is actually back to 1813. What happened in 1906 was that it was unified with two other Catholic schools. One was St. Mary's, which I have not been able to locate, and St. Joseph's. I already mentioned St. Joseph's, but this is a different St. Joseph's. Although they have connections, this is actually two different schools. And these schools started at the hospital. Not that it was connected to the hospital, it was just that they rented rooms here. Once a community school is closed, it's fairly rare that it changes hands because communities have loads of other functions that it can cover in these buildings. For instance, like here, a kindergarten or a youth institution. Incidentally, this building used to be not only a community school but also a high school. Now, high schools traditionally haven't been the property of communities. They were originally state, then later county, and when they were dissolved, it reversed to state. However, since Copenhagen municipality was both a community and a county, they did have some schools. In this case, it was St. Anne's High School. Speaking of high schools, when on Christianshavn they merged the three schools to make one of the buildings, that of Boatman Street, was turned into the high school. Incidentally, the foreground is actually the playing ground belonging to the Christianshavn's daughter school, a private school that's still in operation and therefore not covered here. The two other schools that were merged with it was Princess Street and Queen Street, which has been turned into a community center. That also happened to Chapel Road, which was actually controversial when they built it because it was right next to the churchyard where they buried the victims of cholera. The fear was that it would lead to the spread of the disease, but it turns out to be an irrelevant fear. And only a few years later, they built not only one, but actually two schools right on top of the churchyard. In the case of Øresundsvej School, turning that into a community center came about in a roundabout way because it actually was an enlargement of an already existing center. And right next door, the older school building is still standing. A fourth example of a community school turned into a community center is the North Avenue. When the community moves out, private school can move in, and an example of this is just around the corner on St. John Street. Well, actually the second school, because the first one on the corner from where you can actually see the school at the North Boulevard grew too small, and it's today turned into the combined nursery and kindergarten with the name of North Star. A much earlier example of the private moving in was when the Klassen School had to abandon their previous building due to urban development and moved into one of the older community schools. And the final example of a community school that's not a community school anymore is the Zoo Street. Among other things, it today houses a theater, but it is not as such a cultural center, and it is not in public ownership anymore.